The night started like any other, but quickly went south when my car began sputtering on the empty stretch of road. No cell service, not a single car in sight. Just darkness, trees, and that unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach as the gas gauge edged toward empty. It wasn't a get-out-and-push scenario. I was miles from anything familiar, with no way to call for help. I stepped out, hoping maybe the air would clear my head enough to figure out a plan. The faint sound of rustling leaves came from beyond the road, a reminder that I was alone, or so I thought. Each passing second brought a colder breeze, and a lingering sense that the shadows had a pulse of their own. I decided to walk, hoping to find some sign of civilization, but every step only sank me deeper into the midnight silence. My flashlight, which flickered more than it shone, gave out after a few minutes, casting me into pitch black. It was the kind of black where even your own hand feels like a stranger in the dark. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine, these were heavier, deliberate, trailing somewhere just behind me. I forced myself not to turn around, but every nerve screamed that I was being watched. The steps would stop when I stopped, always just far enough behind me to remain invisible. Each step I took felt like an eternity, each moment more tense than the last. And then the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare breathe, and in that quiet, I heard something worse. A faint, labored breathing, rough and shallow, hovering just over my shoulder. I didn't dare turn around. My whole body froze, every muscle locked tight, yet my mind raced with the horror of what could be lurking just behind me. The labored breathing was so close, I could almost feel it brushing the back of my neck, cold and uneven, like someone was hovering inches away. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I took a slow step forward, hoping the distance might dissolve the fear. But as soon as I moved, the breathing grew louder, more agitated, and suddenly, snap! A twig broke just beside my ear. Something was right there. My body took over, legs springing into a full sprint. I tore down the road, ignoring the searing ache in my lungs, barely able to see anything in the darkness. The road stretched on endlessly, and the oppressive silence around me seemed to close in, muffling the sounds of my own frantic footsteps. After what felt like ages, I spotted a faint glow up ahead. A gas station, maybe, or some shack with a light on. I felt a flicker of hope and pushed harder, nearly stumbling over my own feet in my desperation. As I drew closer, I realized it was an old, rundown gas station, a dimly lit relic from some other time, with a flickering open sign that was half burned out. The place looked abandoned, but I had no choice. Anything was better than staying out on that road. I burst inside and slammed the door behind me, taking in the eerie stillness of the place. The light inside was dim, casting strange, elongated shadows across empty shelves and cracked linoleum floors. There was no one in sight, and no sound but the faint hum of an ancient refrigerator in the corner. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding hollow in the empty space. No answer. I took a shaky breath, letting the silence settle around me. Just the hum of that old fridge, and somewhere deeper in the building, the slow drip of a leaky faucet. My eyes scanned the room, hoping to find a phone, or at least some sort of sign that this place was functional. Then I spotted the clerk. A man sat hunched behind the counter, half hidden in shadow. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and he was completely still, as if he hadn't noticed me enter. Relief flooded through me as I hurried over. "Hey, I'm out of gas, my car's a ways down the road. Do you have a phone?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. He didn't move. I took a step closer, noticing his skin looked off. Pale and waxy, almost like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. The closer I got, the stranger he looked. Eyes half-lidded, mouth parted slightly, as if he were just barely breathing. "Sir?" I said, my voice dropping to a nervous whisper. Still nothing. I reached out, giving the counter a little tap to rouse him, but the man didn't budge. His head slumped forward, finally giving way to gravity, and that's when I realized what I was really looking at. The man was dead. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but as I backed away, my foot kicked something soft. I looked down to find a set of footprints on the floor, outlined in dark, wet smudges. They trailed from the door where I'd come in, all the way to the counter where the clerk sat. But here's the thing, they weren't my footprints. My stomach dropped as I stared at the wet footprints, each one leading from the door to the counter in perfect alignment. but too large to be mine, and too fresh. I backed up, my heart pounding in my ears, eyes flicking from the dead clerk's slumped form to the eerie, dark trail on the floor. Whoever or whatever had left those prints wasn't here now. But they'd been close, maybe watching me, maybe even brushing past me just seconds before I came in. I moved toward the door, my instincts screaming to get out. But as I reached for the handle, the lights flickered once, then died, plunging the room into complete darkness. I froze, standing there in the black, trying to breathe quietly, straining to hear any sound over the thudding of my heart. That's when I felt it. A presence just inches away. Not a sound, not a breath, but that unmistakable sensation of something looming close, of eyes on me in the darkness. My phone. I fumbled for it in my pocket, fingers trembling so badly it almost slipped from my hand. With a desperate swipe, I turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the shadows, landing first on the clerk's lifeless form, then sweeping across the shelves and floor. And then the light found something else. Standing just beyond the counter, in the aisle beside the fridge, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that caught the light and gleamed faintly, watching me. Its mouth twisted into a slow, unnatural smile, revealing teeth that looked sharp and far too many. I took a step back, the beam shaking wildly as I tried to keep it trained on the figure. But the moment I moved, it did too, slinking forward, one deliberate step after another, each movement impossibly silent, as if it were floating. I backed up until I hit the counter, trapped between the dead clerk and whatever was coming toward me. There was nowhere left to go. The thing stopped just a few feet away, still smiling that horrid, twisted grin. Then, without a sound, it lifted a hand and pointed a single, bony finger at the dead clerk, then back to me. I felt a sickening wave of understanding. This thing wasn't just here to scare me. It was here for something else. The thing's finger lingered, pointing first to the clerk, then back to me, as if it was making a decision or a threat. My breath hitched, and every instinct screamed that I was in the presence of something beyond human comprehension, something that didn't belong in this world. In a desperate bid, I swung the flashlight beam toward the door, hoping against hope I could make a break for it. But when I turned the light back, the figure was gone, vanished. Only the dark, silent aisle stared back at me. A chill swept over me as I realized how quiet the place had become. Even the faint hum of the fridge had stopped. I could feel a prickling at the back of my neck, an electric tension thickening the air around me. Slowly, I took a step forward, inching toward the door, willing myself to believe it was over, that the figure was gone, or maybe a hallucination born from the terror and exhaustion. Then, from behind the counter, I heard a faint scraping. The dead clerk's head had shifted, as if something was pulling it upright, and his eyes, those glazed, lifeless eyes, were now wide open, staring right at me. I froze, watching as his jaw cracked open slowly, almost like a puppet. A hollow, rasping sound began to spill from his mouth. Not quite a voice, but more like a distant whisper filtered through water. Out of gas. The voice echoed, distorted and low, as if it were coming from somewhere far below us. The words felt heavy, loaded with a malice I couldn't understand. My knees locked as a wave of nausea hit me, the dark smudges of the footprints on the floor suddenly seeming to stretch and twist, writhing as if alive, forming letters, slowly spelling out a word that made my blood run cold. Run. That was all I needed. I sprinted to the door, yanking it open and stumbling out into the cold night air. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, the darkness pressing in from all sides, swallowing the weak light from my phone. But as I ran, I heard them, the footsteps, matching mine stride for stride, faster and closer with every beat of my heart. Something was following me, gaining ground, and with one last look over my shoulder, I saw it. A shadow figure, moving faster than anything humanly possible, gliding just behind me. I pushed harder, lungs burning, legs aching, until I saw the faint glint of metal up ahead. My car. I nearly collapsed as I reached it, fumbling with the door, praying it would start. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and as I peeled out onto the empty road, I caught one final glimpse in my rearview mirror. The figure standing in the middle of the road, staring after me, its dark outline fading into the shadows as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. I didn't stop even when my gas gauge dipped below empty, because I knew one thing for certain: I'd never truly be out of gas. Not after that night. I thought I'd left it behind. Miles flew by, the sunrise casting its pale light over the road, and for the first time since the nightmare started, I felt a shred of safety. Yet that nagging feeling that I was still being watched hung in the back of my mind like a dark cloud. When I finally pulled into a small diner on the edge of town, my hands shook as I killed the engine. The gas gauge was well below empty, but somehow I'd made it this far. I stumbled inside, hoping the smell of coffee and the presence of people might shake me free from the chill clinging to my bones. The place was almost empty, save for an older man sipping coffee at the counter and a waitress leaning against the wall, lost in her phone. I collapsed into a booth and took a deep breath, but as my gaze wandered, something strange caught my eye. The clock above the counter was stopped. I frowned. I hadn't noticed it before, but the minute and hour hands were frozen in place. At 3:07 a.m., the exact time my car first sputtered out last night, the waitress finally came over, and I tried to shake off the eerie feeling. "Coffee, please," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, poured a cup, and walked back to the counter. I sipped it slowly, hoping the warmth would steady me. But as I glanced down, I noticed my reflection in the metal napkin holder on the table, and my stomach twisted. In the reflection, I wasn't alone. That figure, the same one from the gas station with that hollow, unearthly face, was sitting in the booth directly behind me, watching me through the reflection. Its eyes, empty, dark voids that seemed to pull the light right out of the room, stared straight into mine. I whipped around, my heart hammering, but the booth behind me was empty. Only the quiet din of the diner and the hum of an old refrigerator greeted me. I turned back, my pulse racing, trying to catch my breath. The napkin holder was empty too, my reflection gone. But there, scratched into the tabletop in jagged letters, were the same words I'd seen scrawled in those dark, wet footprints back at the gas station. Out of gas. I stumbled out of the booth, desperate to leave, but when I looked at the old man at the counter, I froze. He was staring at me now, his eyes wide and hollow, his mouth stretched into that same twisted, unnatural smile. "Out of gas," he murmured, his voice dripping with a quiet menace. I backed away, but as I turned to leave, the waitress stood in my path, her eyes empty, that same smile plastered on her face. "Out of gas," she whispered. I bolted for the door, but every face in the diner was turned to watch me now, each one of them mouthing the same words, their voices overlapping in a chilling whisper, echoing through the room. "Out of gas." I burst out the door and sprinted to my car, throwing myself inside. Without thinking, I twisted the key, and to my horror, the engine sputtered, coughing out with a sick, hollow sound. I slammed my hands against the wheel, trying to keep from screaming, as those words played over and over in my mind, each one sinking deeper into my bones. But then, in a final act of desperation, I looked up, glancing into the rearview mirror. The shadow figure was sitting in the back seat, that sinister smile stretched wide, its eyes locking onto mine in the reflection. And then it leaned forward, its breath chilling my ear as it whispered one final, haunting phrase. "You're never really out of gas. I'll be right behind you, every mile." The last thing I remember is slamming down on the gas pedal as hard as I could, knowing that I'd spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment I'd see that figure again, waiting for the day my tank would finally run dry. I don't know how long I drove after that, pushing the car to its limit, the gas gauge long past empty. It was as if the needle itself had frozen in fear, unwilling to budge, as if it knew what would happen if the tank ever ran dry. Days blurred together. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that dark figure, grinning at me from shadows that seemed to breathe and shift. When I finally did sleep, it wasn't rest. It was an invasion, a reminder. The dreams were a mix of cracked reflections and endless highways, all leading back to those words scratched into every surface, every road sign, every mirror. Out of gas. One night, exhausted and desperate for some sort of escape, I pulled into a rest stop. I told myself it would just be a minute, just enough to let my mind settle. The place was deserted, but after days on the road, any sign of life felt like a risk I couldn't take. I left the engine running, an irrational sense of safety, and just sat there, head leaning against the steering wheel, breath slowing, eyes drooping. That's when I heard it again. That quiet, dragging sound, the footsteps. My eyes snapped open, heart racing. They were coming from behind me, pacing slowly around the car, dragging along the pavement with that same relentless rhythm. I looked into the rearview mirror, praying it was just my imagination. But he was there, standing at the edge of the parking lot, the figure's dark outline barely illuminated by my taillights. I could see him better now, his body shifting in odd, unnatural jerks, his smile stretching impossibly wide, as if mocking my exhaustion, my desperation. I threw the car into gear, tires screeching as I sped out of the lot, leaving the rest stop and that dark figure behind. Or so I thought. After a few miles, my headlights picked up something ahead on the road, and my stomach dropped. It was the same rest stop, the same faded sign, the same cracked asphalt. I hadn't made it out. Somehow I was back. I slammed on the brakes, hands shaking as I stared in disbelief. The car idled, engine vibrating under me, a sick reminder of the gas I was burning. I turned around, searching for any sign of that figure, but the lot was empty. Silence filled the air, thick and smothering. And then the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, a hiss that pulsed through the car. But soon, a voice emerged, low and distorted, like it was broadcasting from someplace I couldn't reach or couldn't escape. Out of gas, the voice whispered, the sound twisting into a laugh, echoing through the car as if it were trapped inside with me. Frantic, I shut off the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It filled the car, whispering from everywhere at once, each syllable a heavy weight pressing down on me. It covered my ears, but it was pointless. The words seeped into my mind, relentless and haunting. Desperate, I looked up, and there he was again, standing just outside my driver's side window. This time, his face was inches from the glass, that empty gaze boring into me. His mouth moved, forming words that I couldn't hear but could somehow still feel. Out of gas. I hit the gas pedal with everything I had, tearing down the road, away from that cursed spot, from those haunting words. I drove faster and faster, the speedometer climbing, my pulse racing to match it. And as the miles blurred past, the gas gauge crept lower and lower, until it hovered over the final line, empty. I kept driving, the car sputtering, each moment a countdown to when the tank would finally give out. And then silence. The engine died, the car rolling to a slow stop on the side of the road. I sat there in the dark, gripping the wheel, barely breathing. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but some twisted, morbid part of me had to know. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to the rearview mirror. There, sitting in the back seat, closer than ever, was that dark figure, his eyes glinting in the faint moonlight, his mouth twisting into a smile that promised nothing short of forever. And as his cold hand reached for my shoulder, I finally understood. I was never getting away. The cold hand rested on my shoulder, icy and solid, and I was paralyzed by it, the chill sinking straight into my bones. I could feel the figure leaning in closer, its breath hitting the side of my face in short, ragged gasps, as if it were savoring every ounce of fear that radiated from me. Out of gas, it whispered again, but this time, I heard something else layered beneath the words. Hunger, an insatiable need. I realized this thing hadn't been just haunting me. It had been feeding on me, draining every drop of my fear, my hope, my will. I took a shallow breath, feeling the weight of it beside me, and for a moment, an idea struck. A slim, desperate chance, but my only one. With every ounce of courage I had left, I forced myself to look up, straight into those dark, empty eyes in the mirror. If you want me, I said, voice barely above a whisper. Then come and get me. For a split second, the figure's smile faltered, and the grip on my shoulder tightened, as if it hadn't expected me to fight back. But then, it released me, its hands slipping away as it faded into the shadows of the back seat, those empty eyes vanishing into the darkness. Without a second thought, I shoved the door open and stumbled out of the car, running into the night as fast as I could. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than that car, better than the grip of that thing's cold, dark presence. I ran until my legs burned, until the pounding in my chest became too much. Finally, I collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, my hands trembling. The road stretched out in both directions, dark and empty, as if I were the last person alive. But then, in the silence, I heard it. The distant hum of an engine. Headlights appeared over the horizon, a pair of bright beams cutting through the darkness as a car approached. I stumbled to my feet, waving my arms, desperate for help, praying it wasn't some kind of mirage. The car slowed as it neared, and for the first time in hours, relief washed over me. The driver rolled down the window, a middle-aged man with kind eyes peering out, concern etched on his face. "You all right, kid?" he asked. I hesitated, glancing back down the road, half expecting to see that shadow figure standing there, watching. But the road was empty. "Yeah, I just ran out of gas," I said, the words feeling surreal as they left my mouth. The man nodded, gesturing for me to get in. "Hop in. There's a gas station a few miles back. I'll take you." I climbed into the passenger seat, closing the door behind me, feeling the weight of exhaustion finally settle in. The hum of the car's engine was comforting, a steady rhythm that grounded me, and for the first time all night, I let myself believe I was safe. But as we pulled onto the road, something caught my eye in the side mirror. There, in the back seat, just barely visible in the shadows, was a familiar figure. Still silent, with those same hollow eyes, watching me with that twisted, predatory grin. I froze, every muscle locking in place. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare breathe. "Kid?" the driver asked, glancing over at me. "You all right?" My throat was dry, my heart hammering as I forced myself to look away from the mirror. "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Just tired." The driver nodded, turning his eyes back to the road, oblivious to the nightmare sitting just inches behind us. And as the miles rolled by, I understood that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always be there, lurking just behind me, waiting in the darkness. Because the thing about running out of gas is only the beginning. The miles crept by in a surreal blur, the car's engine humming as if to mock the silence that filled the cab. I sat rigid, refusing to look back, feeling every beat of my pulse drumming out of control as I gripped the seat. It took everything I had not to glance into the mirror, not to check if that shadowy figure was inching closer, watching me with that impossible grin. The driver must have noticed something in my face, because he cleared his throat, glancing over. "You seem on edge, kid. Long night." Something like that I managed to mutter, my voice tight. I couldn't risk saying more, couldn't let on how terrified I was, as if somehow acknowledging the fear would bring that thing closer. "Listen, gas station's just a few miles up," he said, his voice calm and steady, like he was trying to reassure me. "We'll get you sorted out, get you back on the road. You'll be fine." "Fine." I swallowed, the word feeling as hollow as I did. Fine was a distant memory, something from before this, whatever this was. But then I noticed the driver wasn't looking at the road. His eyes had drifted up to the rearview mirror, his brow creased, mouth pulling into a thin line. A flicker of confusion, maybe even fear, crossed his face. "Who's that in the back seat?" he asked, his voice now laced with an edge of suspicion. He glanced over at me, his expression tightening. I didn't have an answer. My blood ran cold, my eyes widening as I forced myself to face the mirror. And there it was. The figure was closer now, barely a foot behind me, leaning forward so that I could see every sharp contour of its hollow, grinning face. Its eyes bored into mine with an intensity that seemed to freeze time, and then it did something I'd never seen it do before. It spoke, or at least it tried to. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. Just an eerie, silent shape of words, mouthing something I couldn't quite decipher. But the driver could see it, too. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his face paling. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a gasp. He didn't wait for an answer. He slammed his foot on the brake, tires squealing as the car skidded to a halt on the shoulder of the road. Without another word, he threw open the door, scrambling out and backing away, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't know what's going on here, kid. But that thing," he shook his head, voice shaking. "I don't want anything to do with it." Couldn't blame him. I wanted to run too, but something kept me frozen, a primal terror rooting me to the seat. And that's when the thing in the back seat leaned forward, its face now inches from mine. Its mouth was still moving, silent words forming over and over, until finally, one word slipped through in a chilling, barely audible whisper. "Home." A wave of nausea hit me as the word settled in. carrying a weight of intent, of command. I'd been running all night, desperate to escape, but now the horrifying truth began to seep in. This thing didn't want me dead. It wanted to follow me, to live in the shadows of my life, to invade my every step, every moment of peace. It wanted to be there every time I turned off the lights, every time I looked over my shoulder, a constant, lurking presence. The driver, still watching from outside, stumbled backward, muttering something under his breath before he turned and ran, leaving me stranded on the dark road with the thing in the back seat. Slowly, I turned back to face it, my entire body numb with fear, my voice barely a whisper as I asked, "Why me?" Its grin widened, and for the first time, I heard a low, guttural chuckle, echoing softly through the car. Because, it hissed, its voice slithering through the silence, "You're the one who ran, and I love the chase." My heart pounded as the full horror sank in. There was no escaping it. Running had only made it stronger, drawn it closer, until it became a part of me, a shadow that I could never shake. And as the thing settled back into the darkness of the back seat, watching me with that twisted, predatory gaze, I understood the grim reality. No matter where I went, no matter how fast or far I ran, it would always be right there, waiting. The night had swallowed me whole. I sat in that car, frozen, the weight of the thing's words pressing down on me like a heavy, inescapable fog. I loved the chase. The road was silent and empty, stretching into endless darkness. I knew deep down that it didn't matter if I started the car and drove for days, if I found the most crowded city, if I boarded a plane and flew across the world. This thing would follow, waiting, lurking just behind me. My every move, every step was now part of its twisted game. And every time I'd stop, it would be there, waiting, with that grin that promised something worse than death. But I couldn't just sit there, couldn't let it take me without a fight. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I glanced back one more time. The figure had retreated into the shadows of the back seat, barely visible now, but I could feel its presence, its eyes watching me with that insatiable hunger. Slowly, I turned the key, the engine roaring to life as if it understood the urgency, as if it knew this was my last chance. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, staring straight ahead, refusing to look back. The car lurched forward, and I accelerated, pushing it to speeds I'd never dared before, the road blurring into a tunnel of trees and shadows on either side. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to get as far as possible, as fast as I could. The air grew thicker, colder, and the dark road twisted ahead, bending in ways that defied logic. The trees seemed to loom in closer, their branches clawing at the sky, twisting in impossible angles, as if the road itself were warping, bending to keep me trapped within its grasp. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. The headlights illuminated shapes on the side of the road, figures standing in eerie stillness, watching as I sped by. Men, women, children, all with vacant eyes, their expressions frozen in twisted, silent agony, their mouths open as if caught in a scream. They lined the road, stretching on for miles, an endless procession of lost souls, each one more distorted than the last. A sickening realization hit me. These were people who had been in my place, people who had tried to escape this thing, and failed. The car's engine strained, the gas gauge dipping dangerously close to empty once again. But I couldn't stop. Not here, not with these silent watchers, these reminders of what awaited me if I slowed down. Then, up ahead, I saw something, a faint glow piercing the darkness. It looked like the lights of a house, standing alone at the end of the twisted road. I didn't have a choice. I aimed the car toward it, hoping against hope that I might find help, that I might finally be free of this nightmare. I pulled up to the house, the engine sputtering one last time before it died, the gas finally truly gone. The house stood in silence, old and looming, its windows dark, but a single light flickering from inside. I took a deep breath and climbed out of the car, every step feeling heavier as I approached the door. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the air thick with an old, musty scent that hinted at years of abandonment. The light came from a single bulb hanging in the hallway, casting a dim, yellow glow that barely cut through the shadows. The walls were lined with old photos, and as I passed them, something caught my eye. The faces in the photos. They were the same figures I'd seen along the road. Each one staring out of their frames with that same look of frozen terror. Their eyes pleading, as if they were trapped within the glass, forever bound to this place. I stumbled backward, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, I heard it, the soft, dragging footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming toward me. It was here. I backed up, my hands fumbling for anything I could use to defend myself. But there was nothing, just an empty hallway stretching into darkness. And that sound, getting closer. The figure appeared at the end of the hall, emerging from the shadows with that twisted grin. Those hollow eyes locked onto mine. But it wasn't just the figure from the car anymore. Its face had changed, shifting and contorting, becoming a grotesque blend of all the faces I'd seen, all the souls it had claimed. It was a moving collage of suffering, a nightmare stitched together from the lives it had taken. I staggered back, but it was no use. The thing advanced, step by slow step, its grin widening, its eyes gleaming with a sick pleasure as it watched me squirm. "You ran," it hissed, its voice echoing through the empty house, filling every dark corner. "And now you'll stay." My back hit the wall, and I knew there was nowhere left to go. The thing loomed over me, its many faces merging into one final nightmarish mask. A face I knew I'd never escape, not even in death. As its hand reached out, icy fingers brushing my skin, I finally understood the horrible truth. This was my home now. This was where I would stay. Another soul in the endless, haunted gallery. Another face frozen in terror, watching and waiting, forever trapped, in a house that no one would ever leave. And as the darkness closed in, the last thing I saw was that twisted, impossible smile, seared into my mind like a brand. A reminder that no matter how far you run, some things can never be left behind. Because once you're out of gas, there's nowhere left to go. The darkness swallowed me whole, a suffocating, endless void. I couldn't tell how long I floated there, suspended in nothingness, every sense dulled, every thought drifting, until it was just me and the terrifying silence. Time didn't exist here. Could have been hours, days, or even years. Then, slowly, I became aware of something. A faint, rhythmic sound, distant but familiar. My heartbeat. It grew louder, grounding me, pulling me back. And with it came the sharp bite of cold air, the rough feel of asphalt beneath my hands. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. I was lying on the side of the road, my car just a few feet away, its lights dim and flickering, as if on the verge of dying. The twisted, haunting house was gone, replaced by the barren stretch of highway I'd been stranded on before this nightmare had started. The air was still, heavy with an unnatural quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Disoriented, I sat up, wincing as a dull ache pulsed through my body. My hands shook as I brushed the dirt from my clothes, glancing around, half expecting to see that dark figure lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching into darkness on either side. I staggered to my feet, my gaze falling on the car. The engine was silent, the gas gauge firmly on empty, but the keys were still in the ignition, and the faint smell of exhaust lingered in the air, as if the car had only just stopped. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, trying to make sense of it. Had it all been some twisted hallucination? A fever dream born from exhaustion and fear? But then, I noticed something. In the dim light from the car's dying headlights, I saw them, footprints. Dark, wet smudges leading from the driver's side door and winding down the road, disappearing into the shadows. A chill crawled down my spine, every instinct screaming at me to turn away, to get as far from here as I could. But something compelled me forward, some desperate need for closure, or maybe a morbid curiosity to understand the depths of this nightmare. I followed the footprints, each step echoing in the stillness. The road seemed to stretch longer than it should, the darkness pressing in, thick and suffocating. The prints continued on, winding down the middle of the empty highway, each one more distorted, as if whatever had left them was dragging itself forward, growing weaker with every step. Finally, the prince stopped. There, in the center of the road, was a single object, placed with eerie precision. A small, cracked mirror. It was old, the glass chipped and fogged with age. But as I leaned down to pick it up, something in its reflection caught my eye. At first, it was just my own face, pale and worn, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. But as I stared, the reflection began to shift, my features blurring, twisting into something else. I watched, horrified, as my own face morphed into the thing I'd seen in the car, that dark figure with the hollow eyes and twisted grin. It stared back at me, mirroring my shock, my fear, its mouth stretching wider and wider, until it was an impossible, grotesque smile, frozen in silent laughter. Panicked, I dropped the mirror, stumbling back, my heart racing. But the image stayed with me, burned into my mind. A grim reminder of the nightmare that had followed me, the darkness that had seeped into my very soul. And as I stood there, trembling on the empty road, I felt it. A presence just behind me, close enough that I could feel its icy breath on the back of my neck, hear the faint rustle of its movements as it leaned in. In a voice barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "You'll never really be alone again." I froze, every nerve alight with terror, as I realized the horrible truth. I hadn't escaped. I'd become part of it, bound to this thing, this entity that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It would follow me, a shadow in the corner of my vision, a whisper in the dead of night, a face staring back at me from every mirror, every reflective surface. Because once you've looked into the darkness, once it's seen you, there's no way back. I staggered back to my car, feeling that presence hovering just out of sight, a reminder of the deal I hadn't meant to make. And as I started the engine, feeling it sputter to life one last time, I knew with a sick certainty that this was only the beginning. I would never truly be out of gas, but I would never be free. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine rumbling beneath me with an ominous, almost mocking pulse. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, and though every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, to find someone, anyone who could help, I knew deep down that it wouldn't matter. That shadow, that thing that had invaded my life, wasn't just behind me. It was inside me now, a lingering poison I could feel with every breath. I tried to calm myself, to gather some sense of logic in the face of what I just experienced. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe my mind had snapped under the strain. But in the back of my mind, I felt that presence, faint but constant, like a heartbeat just out of sync with mine, an echo that would never quite leave. I started driving, my hands clenching the wheel until my knuckles turned white, keeping my gaze firmly on the road, refusing to look into the mirrors. I didn't want to see what might be waiting in the back seat, what reflection might stare back at me with that twisted, inhuman smile. The miles rolled by in silence. Just me, the hum of the engine, and the faint, chilling awareness that I was no longer alone. I drove through the night, past shadowy trees and empty highways, the world outside slipping into a strange, timeless haze. Street signs blurred past, towns I didn't recognize appearing and disappearing on the horizon, each one stranger than the last. Places with names I didn't know, roads that twisted and turned in impossible ways. It was as if reality itself was shifting around me, trapping me in a loop with no escape. Then, just as dawn began to creep over the horizon, I saw it. A diner on the side of the road, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dim morning light. I felt a strange pull toward it, an instinct that defied logic. I needed to stop, to breathe, to remember what life felt like before this nightmare had begun. Maybe even convince myself it was over. I pulled into the lot and killed the engine, the sudden silence filling the car with a weight that pressed down on my chest. I didn't dare check the mirrors. I stepped out, forcing myself not to look back, focusing only on the light spilling from the diner's windows. Inside, the place was deserted, save for an old waitress standing behind the counter, her back to me as she wiped down a glass. The faint hum of a radio played from somewhere in the kitchen, a low, crackling tune that sounded like it was coming from another time. I slid into a booth, trying to shake the cold that clung to me, the feeling that the shadow hadn't stayed behind in the car but had followed me inside, lurking just out of sight. The waitress turned, her face hidden in shadow as she approached with a weary smile. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat, almost robotic. I nodded, unable to find my own voice, my gaze fixed on the table. She set the coffee down in front of me, the cup chipped and stained, and then she didn't leave. She stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You look tired," she said, her voice low, "like you've been running a long time." I looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as if they'd seen things that had drained every last ounce of life from them. Yeah, I managed, forcing a weak smile. It's been a rough night." She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than I was saying. Then, she leaned in, her expression unreadable, and whispered something that froze the blood in my veins. "Some things, once they catch you, never let go." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. A glimpse of that same twisted, mocking grin I'd seen in the shadow, in the mirror, in every dark corner of my mind. I pushed back from the table, the sudden urge to run overwhelming me. But as I looked around, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. Every single booth, every chair, every corner of the diner was filled with people now. Silent, unmoving figures, all staring straight ahead with those same hollow, empty eyes. Their faces were familiar, too familiar. Faces I'd seen in the photos on the walls of that house. Faces that had lined the road, ghostly watchers with expressions frozen in horror. And then, one by one, they all turned to look at me. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding as I realized the horrible truth. These weren't just people. They were souls, souls claimed by whatever darkness had found me, trapped in this endless loop, bound to that figure, that shadow that would never let them go. The waitress leaned in, her face inches from mine, her breath cold as ice. "You're one of us now," she whispered, her eyes darkening as a twisted smile crept across her face. "You can run, you can drive, but you'll always end up here." The figures around me began to rise, moving toward me in silent unison. Their eyes locked onto mine, as if welcoming me into their ranks. I bolted for the door, my heart racing as I tore outside, back into the morning light. My car was still there, waiting, a silent beacon of false hope. I didn't hesitate. I jumped in, turned the key, and floored it, peeling out of the lot, desperate to leave that place, that nightmare behind. But as I sped down the road, I felt it, that creeping, cold presence settling in beside me, an eternal passenger in the seat just out of sight. And in the rearview mirror, I saw them, all of them. Faces staring back at me, hollow and grinning, waiting, watching. And somewhere, in the depths of my mind, I heard the whisper once more. "You're out of gas, but the road, it never ends." I knew then, with a sick certainty, that this wasn't over. It would never be over. I pushed the gas pedal harder, the road stretching endlessly before me, the horizon just a distant smear of light that never got any closer. My hands were shaking, my pulse a wild drumbeat in my ears. But no matter how fast I drove, how many miles I put between myself and that diner, I could feel them. The weight of those eyes, the silent figures who had risen to watch me, each one bound to me, chained in a web of darkness that I knew I'd never escape. The silence in the car was thick, almost suffocating. I knew better than to check the rearview mirror, but my eyes betrayed me, flicking up in a moment of weakness. And there they were, faint outlines in the back seat, as if the shadows themselves were warping, condensing into shapes I couldn't quite see but could feel, watching me with that insidious patience. The road stretched on, and then, almost imperceptibly, the car began to slow. I glanced down, dreading what I knew was coming. The gas gauge, dead on empty, gave one final sputter, and the car coasted to a slow, reluctant stop, stranding me in the middle of nowhere. A chill crawled over me, and I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. Outside, the landscape was barren. a stretch of cracked asphalt cutting through empty fields. There was no movement, no sound, just a haunting, endless silence that felt like a tomb. But I wasn't alone. I felt it before I saw it. The faint whisper of cold air against my neck, the prickling sensation of being watched. I turned, heart pounding, and saw it. The figure was back, seated right beside me, closer than ever. Its hollow eyes stared into mine, its twisted grin widening as it leaned in, whispering words that curdled the very air around us. "You'll drive forever," it murmured, the words sliding through me like ice. "Or you'll join them." A sick dread washed over me as I realized what it was offering. If I gave in, if I stopped running, I'd become one of them. A lost soul, a passenger in this endless night, condemned to haunt the roads, forever part of its twisted game. But if I drove, if I kept going, I'd be hunted, always, by the things sitting beside me, an eternal chase I could never escape. I didn't know what terrified me more, the thought of becoming one of those hollow-eyed watchers, or the idea of being trapped in this chase forever, always just a mile away from freedom but never truly free. Swallowing back the terror, I gripped the wheel and turned the key. The car was empty, out of fuel, but as if by some dark miracle, the engine rumbled to life. I didn't question it. I didn't have a choice. I put the car in gear, my hands steady, my mind strangely calm, and as I pulled back onto the road, I saw it. Just a glimpse, a reflection in the mirror of all those faces, those souls bound to the figure beside me, staring back with a terrible understanding. I would keep driving, because that was the only choice left. I would follow this road, wherever it took me, knowing that somewhere, in the shadows, it was waiting, watching, a passenger I could never leave behind. And as the road stretched out before me, endless and dark, I knew that I would drive and drive until the very end, because some roads never let you go, and some shadows become part of you.